I'm going to be talking about mixed states today, and for those of you who've paid much attention to them, they're hopelessly complicated, confusing beyond reckoning. But they're important and they're potentially dangerous. I was very fortunate that you were not suicidal, but unfortunately many people do kill themselves during these states or feel very suicidal. I think some of the confusion that you allude to about putting things into little boxes, the depressive box and the mania box, can be traced, actually these, as I'll be showing, these states have been well described for 2,000 years. So, I mean, very well described. What happened along the way, I think in the 20th century, was that people got very interested in trying to do research that made it clear that people had or had not had an experience of mania. So in order to do that, they set up categories of bipolar and unipolar, which live with us to this day. They're hopelessly confusing. It's just not correct in any scientific or clinical respect to say. The old European notion was always that manic depressive illness contained within it not only bipolar illness, mania and depression, but also recurrent depression, because we simply don't know what that relationship is between depression and mania. We're getting some better ideas. So some of the confusion is for very good research reasons, actually. I think that mixed states are a particularly human mood state because they affect so many aspects of temperament, or looks like temperament, in terms of irritability, instability, jealousy, depression, hopelessness, all of those things that are contagious and very much affect personal relationships. I'm writing a book at the moment about mixed states in the lives and works of the writers Graham Greene and his first cousin once removed, Robert Louis Stevenson. So I wanted today, just now and again, to put in something by Graham Greene, who was one of the foremost observers of human nature of the 20th century, an astonishingly good writer, an astonishing observer. He was also a journalist and a film critic, so he had a particular eye for that. So his descriptions of his mixed states, came from a family, as he put it, of mad people and melancholic people. He himself was treated for manic depressive illness from the time he was 16. Tried to kill himself on several occasions, and wrote very openly for the time, for being a man, for being, at the time, very openly about his problems with his moods. So when you were talking about your brain exploding, let me just show you what, yes, what Graham Greene had to say. My nerves horribly on edge, that feeling of lurking madness, of something swelling in the brain and wanting to burst. Every sound, however small, made by anyone else, the clink of a fork or on a plate, piercing the brain like a knife. And I think one of the associations with irritability is hyperacusis. People feel things at a lower threshold, and they experience them, and it's extremely irritating when people cross that kind of wire, it's like having wires around you, tripwires, and when people cross those tripwires, it's extremely aggravating, and Greene wrote about that a lot for good cause. So I'm going to be talking today just a bit about history, and mainly history because physicians of antiquity to currently struggled with the same questions. Is this one illness or two? Is manic depressive illness, is depression simply a milder form of mania? What does it look like? What's its resolution? Then talk a little bit about diagnosis and clinical features and suicide and treatment. And then in my conclusions, talk a bit about what Hopkins is doing by way of studying mixed states. So mixed states at the most general level simply means simultaneous existence of manic and depressive symptoms. or in rapid alternation. And again, this is something that's important. It's not just that they're superimposed on one another, it's also that they can follow one another quickly in alternating. So one of the things that I think is very interesting about mood disorders in general is that they are the most consistently described in medical history. So manic depressive psychosis is the only form of mental illness whose chief features may be unequivocally recognized down through the ages. Running through the twisted strands of psychiatric history, its scarlet thread is clearly discernible. And a point that I think, for anybody who did the PhD route rather than the MD route, I think we tend to think of doctoral dissertations as having started whenever we had to first do them. In fact, the doctoral dissertations written before 1750, there are like 1,000 of them on psychiatric illnesses. It's kind of an interesting thing in its own right. But the most important thing was in the study, if you took out the 64 doctoral dissertations written before 1750, the clinical presentation in those 64 studies of mania were that there were no fundamental differences in the clinical presentation over 500 years. So this is remarkably for genetics research in terms of phenotypes, in terms of studying human nature over time. Here's an illness that's really been with us for as long as we've been looking at ourselves. So Hippocrates always had a patient, of course, who was relevant, and he described agitated melancholia. The patient feels something like a thorn stinging his innards. He flees from light and from people. He is terrified and sees frightening visions. The disease attacks most people in the spring. And then the person who's usually given credit for singling out both mixed states and the unity of mania and depression is Aretaeus of Cappadocia. Actually, other people did it before him, but he did it most thoroughly. And he was very careful to say that melancholia really often progressed into mania, and that those states, those transition states, were very much what we would call mixed states today: the high energy, the high voltage, the irritability, the depression. And he, as they say, addressed the question that in some ways goes on today, that melancholia is the beginning and a part of mania. The development of a mania is really a worsening of the disease rather than a change into another disease. Thomas Willis, who many of you will know from his neuroanatomical studies in the circle of Willis in the brain, was also widely sought physician in Oxford for psychiatric problems. And he wrote beautifully, very descriptively. But again, what he described was that these distempers, the mania and the depression, often change and pass from one to another. The melancholic go into the manic into the mechanic, and that these two, like smoke and flame, receive and give place to one another. And again, it's that instability, it's that transition, it's the fluctuation in mood. And I think that's often what's very difficult for people to live with, aside from the irritability and the pressure in the brain, the pressure in the body, the agitation, is that it's just constantly changing. Then Emil Kraepelin, who's credited obviously for delineating very systematically the forms that mixed states can take in a somewhat, you could say almost obsessive sort of way. I mean, of every possible combination of volition, mood, thinking. What he observed as well was that you have these mixed forms where you cannot in any way clinically say it is just mania or it's just depression. You have to say that it is a mixture of the two. And he, more than anyone, really put mixed states on the map. he also said that you could see mixed states in one of two ways. One way would be as a transition. So you're going from mania into depression or depression into mania, and you've got that period where the mood and the affective states are fluctuating, going back and forth. Another is that you could have mixed states in their own right, in their own form. So this, I just pulled this study, which is a little complicated here, but it's a great study. It's a sort of study you couldn't begin to do now. It was done at the NIMH many years ago with a study of 20 acutely manic patients, unmedicated. So obviously you wouldn't be doing that now for a number of reasons. But what the clinicians did was to look at ratings of dysphoria, mania, and psychosis, and what they found, their basic finding was that people, when they were most manic, were most dysphoric. So this old notion that you were somehow necessarily transitioning, it was that you were really as manic as you were going to get, you were also as depressed as you were going to get. And that there were these stages of mania, and that people went from very mild hypomania to psychotic mania, and then they went down from that stage 3 mania to stage 2 to stage 1, almost in reverse of how they went into the mania. So psychosis was the last thing to kick in stage 3, and it was the first thing to clear when people were getting better. But many of the symptoms that they dealt with were mixed states. So how do you diagnose mixed states? Well, it depends on, I mean, you can always go to the DSM because it's sort of legal and carved in the wall and boring. Or you could go, the Europeans have criteria, researchers have criteria. I'm going to give, the DSM-4 outdid itself in incompetence in defining mixed states. And they had to completely revamp what they meant, because when they, DSM-4 basically said you had to have a full-blown mania and a full-blown depression at the same time for it to be mixed states. So it made no sense. It made no sense clinically. It made no sense research-wise. So what they came up with was a specifier, and a specifier for bipolar illness and a specifier for depressive illness. And so basically, the specifier for bipolar illness was having 3 symptoms of depression. And the specifier for major depressive disorder was to have all the criteria for major depression, but with 3 symptoms or more of mania. You can see how this gets complicated. You can see how, how long does it mean if you say somebody's got more talkative than usual? Do you mean for, a day, 2 days, 5 days? These are not really great criteria, but they're the ones we've got. But what we do know is study after study after study that mixed features are very common in both bipolar disorders and major depression. So this idea that used to be that this was pretty unusual, in fact, a third of people who have bipolar disorder, whether it's bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, experience mixed features, and in major depression, almost as many. And the question comes up, if you have mixed features, does that mean you are, by definition, bipolar? I think the jury's out on that. I think most people would probably say yes, but it's not clear, and it varies from study to study. This is just going back to Weigand, who was Kreplin's student and who really wrote the treatise on mixed states. You can see in his sustained mixed episodes, in other words, not transitional states, were about 14% of his patients. And then as time has gone by, people come up with generally a higher rate. And some of that's probably ascertainment. We're more aware of mixed states now. Their criteria exist more formally now. But also, there may be a genuine increase because of the use of antidepressants, precipitating the onset of mixed states. This is an interesting review of mixed states in pediatric bipolar disorders, and it has far and away the highest rate of mixed states, which is what you'd really expect in many ways just by the clinical presentation of mixed states, of how pediatric bipolar patients present, which is much more of a mixed presentation than if you're an adolescent or later. Okay, so there are a lot of pretty consistent findings about mixed states in terms of clinical features. One is universally poorer clinical outcome. But again, it gets down to what do you mean by having a mixed state? Is that one mixed state? You've had recurrent mixed states. You never have anything but mixed states. But if you have predominantly mixed states, you have a poor clinical outcome. In these studies that have been done, there have been quite a few factor analytic studies and cluster analysis. This is a review of 30 of these studies, looking at what is it that goes into mixed state? What are the features of, clinical features of mixed states? And two come out time and time again. One is psychomotor activation, and it should be independent of polarity. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you're depressed or manic, and the presentation is dominated by psychomotor agitation and dysphoria, the sense of irritability, hostility, the feeling wired, feeling like you want to put your fist through the wall, that kind of thing. Koukopoulos, Athanasio Koukopoulos, who was a Greek-Italian psychiatrist, has long been interested in excitatory states and what is it that makes people vulnerable to mixed states and to being precipitated into mania. And he reviewed a lot of things. I think nobody would really agree with Pinnell, but that was a long time ago, that mania is the typical and frequent mental illness. But the others, researchers and clinicians, have emphasized time and again, and I think it's very important to not only the clinical treatment, but also to research into understanding the basic mechanisms of mixed states, that excitement is the fundamental affect, and that you ignore that at your own peril, that it's the excitatory phenomena in mixed states and mania that are really the driving forces. And he was very interested in adaptivity. Why do these states evolve and stay at a population rate that's pretty high? And one was that in the case of mixed states and mania, that high activity is an asset throughout nature. That high energy, hyperactivity, aggression, hypersexuality, and creativity are both excitatory and adaptive, and then at some point they go awry, but that the fundamental mechanism, underlying mechanism, is probably a healthy one for society anyway, if not the individual. So I did a study a very long time ago with British writers and artists, the most eminent in Great Britain, and most of them have been treated for mood disorders, and I was interested, they've kind of rated themselves across time, and then periods of time where they were unusually creative and active. And so there were these creative episodes, intense creative episodes. And not surprisingly, pronounced elevation of mood was most common. And that's very consistent with a very large literature, that it's elated mood, it's flight of ideas, those kinds of very rapid things. But what I was surprised to find out was really a quarter of them described before their very creative periods profound distress, discomfort, suicidality, agitation, and basically mixed states. And so there's something in that discontent, that restlessness, that goes with a particular kind of accomplishment, perhaps. Unfortunately, that's a small part of mixed states, and what we know most clinically, I think, about mixed states is that they put people at risk for suicide, greater risk for suicide and attempted suicide. So this is Emil Kraepelin on mixed states and suicide. And what he describes so beautifully is that agitation, perturbance, complete inability to do anything but act on killing yourself. The patients therefore often try to starve themselves, to hang themselves, to cut their arteries. They beg that they may be burned, buried alive, driven out into the woods, and there allowed to die. One of my patients struck his neck so often on the edge of a chisel fixed on the ground that all the soft parts were cut through to the vertebrae. And again, it's that violence. It's not passive suicide. It's very violent, agitated suicide. Graham Greene had more than his fair experience of feeling suicidal. He also described remarkably well ennui, what we call loss of pleasure in ordinary activities. I mean, ordinary people say ennui or discontent. And he had terrible ennui, then he'd get agitated and get one of these mixed sort of states. And he played Russian roulette. So he said, I put the muzzle of the revolver into my right ear and pulled the trigger. There was a minute click, and looking down at the chamber, I could see that the charge had moved into the firing position. I was out by one. So there's a slew of studies going way back showing the increased risk for suicidal behaviors. And one of the things I want to come back to in terms of treatment is, why do we not study the role of lithium? Even if lithium doesn't work well in mixed states, why don't we use it adjunctively at a dosage unknown, at a level unknown, to try and prophylax against the suicide, the impulsivity, the agitation. Okay, so talking about treatment, I want to focus a little bit on self-prescribed treatment, because really, in point of fact, in the real world, patients treat themselves all the time, and their doctors aren't around, giving out prescriptions. I mean, people figure out ways to make themselves more comfortable, less miserable. And then medical and psychological. Psychological, in terms of psychotherapy, next to nothing is done. There are like 2 studies, not great. And we just don't know. It's hard, as you can imagine, to do psychotherapeutic research on mixed states. But let me just talk a little bit about self-prescription, about, again, getting back to Graham Greene. He wrote a book called Ways of Escape. Some of these are in there, and some of them are in his other writings. But how do you deal with constant restlessness? I mean, he was an unbelievably restless man. I mean, gin and whiskey, brothels, a lot of brothels, Nebutol, opium, amphetamines, Russian roulette, a lot, war zone journalism. Graham Greene was a great journalist, went to war zones in Vietnam and Africa and every place where there was really high-risk fighting and bullets flying. Catholicism, very famously, struggled after he converted from Church of England to Catholicism, struggled with Catholicism the rest of his life, but that was a form of dealing with a lot of his psychological issues. And finally, writing and work. And this is, if you talk with writers and artists, this is what people will say, scientists, lawyers, and Osler. I mean, Osler, who said, that work is the greatest balm for wounded souls and wounded minds. And I think this is really true. And again, it's not that you can go prescribe somebody, go write, although Graham Greene's psychiatrist did do that, and a great book came out of it. Likewise with Robert Lowell, his psychiatrist said, go write, and he did. But it's to say that it's just important to ask people what they do and how they survive, not just the awful side. So Graham Greene said, "Writing is a form of therapy. Sometimes I wonder how all those who do not write, compose, or paint can manage to escape the madness, the melancholia, the panic fear which is inherent in the human condition." So finally, the treatment of mixed states, I just recommend to you the article in 2021 article, the Canadian and the International Bipolar Disorders recommendations for bipolar mixed states. Their recommendations are all over the map. There are a few consistent findings. One is, of course, as everyone here will know, strong evidence for efficacy of ECT in treating mixed states, that the use of antidepressants should be sparing and or covered by mood stabilizer. And again, I get back to the issue of why do we not know, given the huge literature now on the efficacy of lithium in preventing suicide, why do we not use lithium adjunctively, if not as the primary treatment, but adjunctively, at least see whether it works or not. And I think with mixed states, it would be a good place to start. You know, it may well be you don't have to have nearly as high a blood level. But I just think that that's something that, given the death rate in mixed states, it would be important to try. On the slightly discouraging side of the street, the 20-year trends for how psychiatrists practice in outpatient settings, the prescription of antidepressants without a mood stabilizer has increased from 18% to 41% in recent years. I mean, you would think with all of the CME and, you know, education and so forth about how you need to protect people against the excitatory effects of antidepressants. No, the rate's gone down, way down, in terms of using mood stabilizers as protection. So finally, I just get back to Graham Greene for a moment, that one knows the reasons for sadness. One looks in vain for the causes of melancholia. And I think that's true, and it's true of mixed states. There's been a lot more research in recent years on mixed states than there has been, but it's still pretty relatively ignored field. So one of the things, Hopkins is doing a series of things to try and work on this. BD2, the large research project, which hopes to recruit 4,000 patients over 5 years. There are 15 clinic sites. Today, 60 to 70% of those enrolled have a history of mixed states. So that's a very high rate. You know, who knows what the reason for that is. We're going to have a consensus meeting on mixed states next year and get together all the people who study mixed states, and from the basic sciences to clinical care, and try and come up with some general agreement about what we do and do not know. The Precision Medicine Center here is working on all sorts of basic issues, and I think we'll come up with, I mean, what you obviously hope to do is find much more specific treatments for very specific forms of bipolar illness. And just want to point out the work of a young scientist here who is actually not doing mixed states so much, but she's doing organoid research. And some of the organoid research is actually kind of interesting. Yale University is doing quite a bit of that with mood disorders and hopes to do some mixed state work. But this is from Dr. Kathuria's lab here, looking at just working on developing organoids and hopefully that have mixed states that they create. And then finally, just conclude with mixed states are potentially lethal, often destructive. Accurate diagnosis and treatment are critical. Psychomotor agitation is the core feature of mixed states. We need to define that more carefully. I mean, we ask in diagnostic workups, but it's not as detailed as it could be. Just like you're talking about anxiety and the big issues, you know, what's anxiety, what's agitation, what's internal, what's external. I think we could live with a lot better definitions of agitation and anxiety. The clinical description of mixed states has remained remarkably consistent for more than 2,000 years. And I say that because I think that's really important. I think it really says something not only about human nature and the problems that people have had and the temperaments that people have, but also, again, about the phenotype. If you're trying to, it's something in there is constant. It's not like just kind of, you know, 20th century neuroses that kind of came and went. These things have been around for a long time. Oops. I think. Yeah. Thank you. I also meant to thank you for the beautiful music. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kay. That was really beautifully done and very, very thought-provoking. You know, I was quite fascinated by your focus on psychomotor agitation and dysphoria as the two core features, which makes tremendous sense to me, because I always think about dysphoric mania and agitated depression as the two among the many Kraepelin mixed states that he talks about. Those are the two that seem to come up all the time, and they both have dysphoria and psychomotor agitation. I guess I don't know if you have thoughts about making that distinction. I've heard people say, oh, well, it's not bipolar disorder, it's agitated depression.
Right.
And I suppose the downside, you're talking about the importance of lithium, the downside in calling it depression might be people might be less likely to use lithium.
I do think the jury's out. I mean, if I had to place a bet for whatever reason, I would say I think agitated depression is a form of bipolar disorder, because I think that these boxes, diagnostic boxes, are not enormously helpful nor accurate. Kukopoulos, for example, would say, and has written about and developed diagnostic criteria saying agitated depression is bipolar illness. You know, a lot of people feel it's bipolar illness, and a lot of people who study depression think it's depression. So, you know, that's not real good diagnostic reasoning.
Right. Other folks have questions. Dr. Bienvenu.
Thank you. That was a great talk. Thank you for talking about one of the scariest things for me as a psychiatrist is mixed states. So that's the nice thing I have to say. The one thing I have to ask is, how can you diagnose bipolar I disorder in somebody who's never been manic?
How can you diagnose bipolar I in someone who's never been manic?
I wouldn't. I don't think you can. I think that, no, and I'd be surprised if very many people did. I think that if mixed states are in there, it's often because somebody's had at least one manic episode, or they meet the full criteria for mania.
Thank you. Other folks? Dr. Margolis.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm thinking about these different manifestations, how to classify them. Is it actually, we reach a point where we chopped up different types of symptoms and trying to categorize them and not categorize them? We hit a point where we cannot go further without biological correlates.
I believe that completely.
Let me just repeat the question. Are we at a point where you really can't go any further if you don't have biological correlates in terms of slicing and dicing diagnosis?
Right. I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, you know, we're waiting for science. I mean, I think that hopefully at the end of the BD2 work of 4,000 individuals, many of whom have that, all the, you know, biological measures are being taken and scanning and so forth. So hopefully we'll know a lot more about that, and also about the experience of it. We put in a bunch of questions just asking about what do you experience when you experience mixed states, what would help you, what does not help you, those kinds of things. But I think it's hard to say because you get into, it's an area of intrinsic fascination, and it attracts very obsessive people in the sense of slicing and dicing, as you say, of putting little categories. And some of these diagrams that come out of these articles are just something to behold. And you, after you read them, you think, are you any further along in understanding? And no, but somebody's had a good time, you know?
Dr. DiPaolo.
Thank you, Kate, for more than today's talk. Thank you for coming to Hopkins. Kate, all of our life with her. But I want to say that, you know, the interesting thing is, for me, having been on some of these committees, like DSM-5, is that these categories we create are, I'm told, meant to not only illuminate, but also to provoke. And so they work very well as provocations. And I think they help us focus on what we don't know, what we fight about, what we talk about. So that's good. When lithium came out, there was also because people were so doubtful of its benefit and couldn't easily describe at what point you describe somebody's responder, they described a lithium failure as a single episode of the illness during lithium treatment. Okay, so I think that, and people that, so that the idea that lithium might help a great many of these patients didn't all would be called lithium failures because they're still real.
Right, right, and you get into the issue with lithium responsiveness of, you know, which comes first. If you've got your manic episode followed by depression, that you're more likely to respond to lithium. Well, what does that do with mixed states when you've got these incredibly rapid cycling phenomena? No, I think that, I think DSM does a remarkably good job at provoking. I'm not sure about the illuminating on the depressive side. I think they do a pretty good job on bipolar illness. I think the depression, you know, is sort of like if you've been alive, you've been depressed. But yeah.
Other folks? Dr. Sharp.
Hey there. Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated how many different kinds of data sources you drew from, including biography and this very sensitive appraisal of the aesthetics of your biographical subject or perspective. I was wondering if you could talk more about some of the things that you've learned from biographical method and how that's seasoned in your clinical intuition or research.
Can you talk about the biographical method and how that's informed your thinking?
Sure. I think that, to me, the lives of people, I mean, given a choice of something to read, I would read biography because I think reading lives is fascinating. In terms of psychopathology, if you've got people who can really write and aren't beholden to jargon, you're very lucky indeed. And I think someone like Graham Greene, who was, I would say, sardonic on a good day and a little jaded, but had a view of human nature that was actually very broad and could sort pathological from non-pathological, but understand that there was a continuum. And I think great writers and people who've been covered in biography are able to make that both broadness of understanding of human nature and then when it's really sick and when somebody's really sick. So I feel privileged. I mean, I was very young when I first got sick. I was in high school. I was a senior in high school. And my English teacher gave me a couple of books by volumes of poems by Robert Lowell. And it didn't make me well, but it certainly changed my life. And I think that, you know, whenever possible, I load books on people, you know, and I'm fully aware that most people aren't going to read them, but still.
Let me wrap up with a book question, which is, do you know when the mixtape book's going to come out? Is it next year or the year after or no pressure?
I could answer, my editor could answer. I think different answers.
Thank you for a wonderful grand rounds. Really.
Thank you.